9 Unresolved Mysteries of Australia. As far as settings go, there's no better place for a mystery than Australia. Wild, rugged, and filled with vast expanses hardly touched by human hands, there's plenty of space for people to disappear into. It's romantic, beautiful, and undeniably eerie. 1. What happened to Australia's megafauna? Huge land turtles, 8-foot-tall kangaroos, massive cold-blooded killer goannas. These are but a few of the giant animals that once roamed Australia, during the Quaternary, the period of geological time that we often refer to as the Ice Ages. But what happened to these megafauna? When did they go extinct and why? It's a research area that I am most fascinated by. And talking to others, it's definitely something that inspires a lot of discussion and debate. I mean, who doesn't love a good mystery, right? And in this case, it's an Ice Age cold case and one of the biggest research questions in the Australian paleosciences. I recently had the privilege of being invited to give a presentation for Br Science. Br Science is a Brisbane-based monthly lecture series that aims to bring scientists and their science out of the lab and deliver it direct to the public. So for me, that meant packing up my thoughts and turning it into something digestible and interesting for a diverse audience. It doesn't matter if you're a hardcore scientist, or just a regular person walking down the street, everyone seems to have an idea about what happened to the megafauna. For scientists, they might form their opinion based on reading scientific literature. For members of the public, a lot of the time their thoughts might be crafted by things like media reports or easily accessible information websites such as Wikipedia. Working in this space day in, day out, it's sometimes hard to gauge what people outside of the research community actually think. But here at Br Science, I had an opportunity to go direct to the public and get their thoughts. Why the megafauna went extinct, the audience votes. During the presentation, rather than have the audience put up their hands and shout things out, I used Mentimeter software to pose the question, why did the megafauna go extinct? The audience was invited to go to a particular website and type in answers using their phones. The answers were then broadcast live directly into my PowerPoint presentation as an evolving word cloud. The results were really fascinating. There were 105 respondents out of the 300 or so in the room. Aside from a few creative answers such as unicorns, Jesus, and flying spaghetti monsters, there seemed to be a clear candidate for the extinctions: climate change. Science tells us that the time of the megafauna was punctuated by repetitive wet and dry phases in climate, with a long-term trend towards progressively drier and drier conditions. In fact, the last glacial cycle that led into the most recent ice age was the harshest episode of climatic change of the entire Quaternary. But I didn't tell the audience that prior to the survey. All I had mentioned was that humans arrived in Australia around 55,000–60,000 years ago, that the Quaternary was characterized by swings in climate, and that the megafauna were, mostly, extinct. Climate change was not the answer that I was expecting. I thought it would have been human hunters for sure. But, in a way, I found a lot of comfort in the overarching public view. That's not because I necessarily think that climate change wiped out all 90 species of Australian megafauna, but because of the worrying way that the debate has been playing out of late. There has been a spate of finger-pointing research articles recently, all arguing that human hunters solely drove the extinctions. Those research articles have translated into extensive and global media coverage as well, with headlines screaming out, "People did it." I've read those research papers very closely and must say that I'm not convinced. Aside from some howling mistakes, like this one reporting the extinction of the kangaroo, Macropus, 43,000 years ago. Macropus are very much alive and well, and include modern species like red and gray kangaroos, as well as 13 or so other extant members. The data just don't stack up to comprehensively prove that humans did it. Ideally, to test the human overkill model, you need to first show that as soon as humans arrived, all 90 species of megafauna immediately went extinct, and that climate change was not significant at the time. A close reading of the actual datasets shows only around 15 species of megafauna date to the time period of human arrival. Most species significantly predate humans, or have no reliable dates at all. That is, we don't even know when the majority of megafauna evolved, let alone went extinct. As for climate change, a huge range of independent datasets demonstrates a big shift toward arid conditions right around the time of human arrival, so obviously, climate change cannot be excluded from the extinction equation. The Bree Science Survey was a great exercise in the end. The thing that pleased me the most, perhaps with the possible exception of whoever gave the answer flying spaghetti monster, was seeing a public that are independent thinkers and are driven in seeking out the truth using alternative media. 2. Death in the Valley, the mystifying double murders at Wangatua Station. While it was still in operation, the Wangatua Station, located in a secluded valley in the Victorian Alps of Australia, was considered the most isolated homestead in Victoria. It was also the site of one of Australia's most mystifying double murders. In 1917, Wangatua Station was managed by a man named James Jim Barclay. Barclay hired a cook named John Bamford, who was known to be surly and possessed of a wicked temper. What informed Barclay's decision to hire Bamford is unknown, but with World War I raging, the available labor pool must have been fairly thin. What is known is that Albert Stout, the shopkeeper at the nearest town of Talbotville, some 20 miles away, warned Barclay against being drawn into arguments with Bamford. Bamford started working at Wangatua Station on December 14, 1917. Within a year, both Barclay and Bamford would be murdered, and their deaths would go unsolved. The last time both Barclay and Bamford were seen alive was when they left Talbotville on December 21, 1917, after voting in a public referendum. While it is unclear which way they voted, they are believed to have been in agreement on the issue. On January 22, 1918, Harry Smith, the stepson of the original owner of Wangatua Station and a good friend of Barclay's, arrived to deliver the mail. Neither Barclay nor Bamford were present. Both bedroom doors were locked. Bafflingly, the words, "Home tonight" had been written in chalk across the kitchen door. Smith remained at the station for 2 nights but saw no one, and so left on January 24. He arrived back on February 14 to find the mail untouched where he had left it, and the chalk words still on the door. This time, Barclay's dog Baron was there, looking undernourished and neglected. Smith spent the night alone at the station, and the next day arranged for a telegram to be sent to Arthur Phillips, the station's current owner. After a search lasting several days, Barclay's body was found in a shallow grave near Conglomerate Creek about 420 paces from the station. By the time his body was discovered, Barclay had already been dead for several weeks. A post-mortem revealed that he had been shot in the back. The police found a shotgun in Barclay's room that had been recently fired. Perhaps most bizarrely, the authorities discovered foodstuffs laced with strychnine during their investigation at the homestead. Despite this, there is no evidence that either Barclay or Bamford, who, at the time, was nowhere to be found, were ever poisoned. In the immediate wake of the discovery of Barclay's body, Bamford was considered the most likely suspect. A manhunt began. In November 1918, authorities located their suspect, albeit in an unexpected state. Bamford's body was found partially buried under a pile of logs near the Howard Plains hut on Mount Howard, some 20 miles away from Wangatua Station. A post-mortem analysis revealed a bullet lodged in his skull. What happened to the 2 men remains a mystery to this day. The official verdict in both cases was murder by person or persons unknown. Some maintain that Bamford killed Barclay, and was then killed by Barclay's friends. It's hard to imagine that Barclay's friends would have left Barclay's body to rot for such a long stretch of time, however, had they been aware of the murder. Robbery is often suggested as a motive for the twin slayings. Yet while several personal items were stolen from Barclay's home, other valuables were left behind, making theft a dubious explanation. Ultimately, the reason for the 2 deaths, and their connection to one another, if any, is likely to remain a mystery. Years later, Barclay's son, who later worked for Harry Smith for several years, was interviewed about the murders. His cryptic statement may be the best epitaph for the strange case: "It was all a long time ago and both the murderers are long since dead. I can't see that anything can be gained now, it's all best forgotten." 3. The disappearance and murder of Juanita Nielsen. Eddie Trigg died 8 days ago. He was alone in his small, clean and tidy room at the Abbott's Hotel in Waterloo. According to police, there are no suspicious circumstances. His death, at 72, would be unremarkable but for the fact he was the last person to see the heiress and anti-development campaigner, Juanita Nielsen, alive. That was at the Carousel nightclub in King's Cross on July 4, 1975. Indeed, Trigg may well be the person who killed her, acting on the wishes of his nightclub boss and a wealthy developer. With his lonely, alcoholic death, those secrets have been taken to the grave and the chances of the case being resolved, or of Nielsen's remains being found, are now negligible. Fairfax Media has been told the Homicide Squad's cold case team was notified of Trigg's death in case he left any clues, such as a manuscript for a book he was rumored to be writing. If it ever existed, it hasn't yet been found. Nor has Nielsen's body. No one has ever been charged with her murder. The disappearance of Nielsen, who vigorously opposed high-rise development in Victoria Street, Potts Point, raised issues of corruption and cronyism in Sydney long before the Wood Royal Commission into the NSW police, and long before anyone had heard of Eddie Abide. Born in 1937, Juanita Nielsen was a member of a wealthy family that ran the retailer Mark Foy's. She was independent, privileged and precocious. In his book, Killing Juanita, author Peter Rees describes a meeting between her and one of her cousins at a family wedding in Bellevue Hill. During the evening, the cousin recalled, "This gorgeous creature who looked like a French model and sounded like Tallulah Bankhead came up to me and said, 'Darling, could you get me a whiskey please?' The head waiter told me she couldn't have one. I asked why? He said she's only 12. In the 1970s, living in a terrace at 202 Victoria Street, she started a local newspaper called Now, which was mostly advertorial. But she took a strong stance against the high-rise development proposed by the businessman Frank Thiemann, which would have seen the demolition of many of the stately terraces in Victoria Street. As the 1983 inquest into her death heard, it was a tumultuous time. Residents opposing the massive development clashed with police and heavies hired by Thiemann. Many were fearful and with good reason. One protester, Arthur King, was thrown in the boot of a car and kidnapped. Fortunately, he survived. A barrister, John Baston, told the inquest, "There was an air of violence and confrontation in the street. The Builders Laborers Federation supported the residents, imposing green bans that delayed Mr. Thiemann's controversial proposal." Counsel for the Nielsen estate, Neil Newton, said Thiemann had the motive to get rid of Nielsen because she was holding up his project and costing him money. Hers was the voice that would not be stilled and hers were the hands that would not cease to write in opposition, he said. The court heard that Thiemann was on friendly terms with Jim Anderson, the manager of the Carousel and other King's Cross clubs. Anderson had a fearsome reputation in the red light area, partly because he had shot and killed standover man Donnie the Glovesmith and partly because Anderson worked for the notorious Abe Saffron. Anderson in turn had employed Trigg at the Carousel Cabaret. Trigg had a troubled childhood and was placed in an institution. He went on to become a small-time criminal. In July 1975, he was managing the Carousel's VIP bar. And that is where Nielsen went on July 4th, the last day of her life, ostensibly to discuss the Carousel placing advertising in her paper. Police eventually charged Trigg and two others with conspiracy to abduct Nielsen, but they didn't have enough evidence to go one step further and say who had actually committed the murder. In 1983, Trigg surprised everyone by pleading guilty to the conspiracy charge. He was sentenced to 3 years jail with non-parole of 15 months. He later insisted he was innocent. Rees said on Friday Trigg was a heartbeat from Juanita's final moments. He said he believed it was Trigg who killed Nielsen and disposed of her body at the behest of Anderson, who in turn was doing the bidding of Thiemann. Thiemann and Anderson always denied any involvement in the killing. Both are now dead. Police said Trigg was found in his room at the Abbott's Hotel about 11:45 p.m. on Saturday, February 23. He basically drank there every day. "I got the impression he smoked and drank himself to death," a police source said. "It's a bit of a sad day really, Eddie taking it to the grave. It doesn't leave many options. Down, but maybe not totally out." Officially, the strike force Euclid will remain active. Anyone with information is urged to contact the police. 4. What happened to Dan Kelly? The Kelly Gang of bushrangers was formed in April 1878, following a confrontation at the Kelly family home at Greta, in the northeast of the colony of Victoria. After an argument with Constable Fitzpatrick, in which the policeman was slightly wounded, Edward, Ned Kelly and his younger brother Dan took off to hide in the nearby Wombat Ranges. The brothers were soon joined by two of their friends, Joburn and Steve Hart. In the following months, police parties continued to pursue the Kelly brothers, not realizing that their two companions had joined them. It was a standard police operation, with search parties combing the countryside, and suspected friends and collaborators being questioned. Events took a new and dramatic turn, however, on October 26, 1878 when Ned Kelly and his three companions surprised a police party at a campsite near Stringy Bark Creek and ordered them to bail up. In the ensuing gun battle, three policemen, Sergeant Michael Kennedy, and Constables Thomas Lonergan and Michael Scanlon, were killed by the Kellys and their friends. A fourth officer, Constable Thomas McIntyre, managed to hide and later escaped unhurt. Within days, the four members of what soon became known as the Kelly Gang were declared to be outlaws. The police effort to apprehend the Kellys, an uncoordinated endeavor before these killings, was immediately intensified. The hunt for the Kelly Gang was the biggest and most expensive police exercise in the history of the colony of Victoria, but it failed to produce quick results. Before long, with the usual means at its disposal failing, the police came under increasing pressure to adopt new strategies. They transferred large contingents of extra police to the northeastern district of Victoria, forcibly detained Kelly sympathizers, to help dissuade local support, and activated police informers and spies. One of the more interesting tactics, although not a new one, was the employment of Aboriginal men from Queensland to track the movement of the fugitives around the surrounding area, particularly in and out of the rugged terrain of the Wombat Ranges. This use of Queensland Aborigines was not the preferred choice of the Victorian police. The Chief Commissioner wanted to capture the Kelly Gang without the assistance of outside organizations. But following the Kelly Gang's daring and successful raid on the town of Geraldry on February 8, 1879, it was clear that his police force could not cope with the situation and in fact did need such assistance. It was while the gang was hiding out in the Wombat Ranges that they had the idea of making their famous suits of armor. It is not known where the inspiration came from, but it has been suggested that Ned Kelly was familiar with the novel Lorna Doone, in which the outlaw heroes appear in iron armor. The armor may have been modeled on sets imported for a Chinese street parade in 1873, and probably seen by members of the gang in Beechworth. The four suits of armor were used only once, at the final confrontation between the gang and police at Glenarvan, on June 28, 1880. In the early hours of the morning, the four outlaws stood on the veranda of Mrs. Jones's hotel and fired on the police surrounding the building. Later, Ned Kelly left the hotel wearing his armor and engaged in a final shootout with the police. He was captured alive after being brought to the ground with wounds to his legs. The other members of the gang were killed in the siege. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart were dead before a fire consumed the hotel. It is unclear whether they had been shot by police or chose to commit suicide. Joburn had died earlier from a bullet wound to the groin. Ned Kelly was tried in Melbourne and executed on November 11, 1880 at the Old Melbourne Jail. By a strange twist of fate, his mother was being held at the same prison, on a 3-year sentence that had resulted from the same affray with Constable Fitzpatrick that had led to her son going into hiding. After being captured by the police, the four sets of Kelly armor had divergent histories. Joburn's set was given away a couple of days after the Glenarvan siege. The three remaining sets were initially retained by Victoria Police and were possibly mixed up. One set was transferred to the trustees of the State Library and went on display at the aquarium until the mid-1950s. This set is still held by the library and is now on display at Melbourne Museum. The other remaining sets are also on public display, one at the Old Melbourne Jail, the other in the Victoria Police Museum. 5. The Wanda Beach Murders. The chilling black and white photo is burned into Hans Schmidt's memory. It's the prevailing image of his big sister, Marianne, lying in a sandy grave, her throat slit ear to ear. Now, almost 50 years later, Mr. Schmidt believes the world needs to see the shocking pictures of his sister and also those of her best friend, Christine Sherrick. in the hope one of Australia's most haunting crimes, the Wanda Beach murders, will finally be solved. Mr. Schmidt, now a 63-year-old father of 3, still recalls the windy Sydney morning of January 11, 1965, when he said his final farewell to 15-year-old Marianne. It was an unremarkable, hurried affair. The Schmidt family matriarch, Elizabeth, was in hospital ill, and 6 months earlier the father of the 7 Schmidt children, Helmut, had succumbed to cancer. Mr. Schmidt and his older brother, Helmut Jr., were to stay home and clean the family's Westride home while Marianne and her best friend, next-door neighbor Christine, took the 4 youngest Schmidt children to Cronulla for the day. "We lived in Westride and Cronulla was our local beach, because we could just jump on a train to get there," Mr. Schmidt said. They went to the beach early in the morning, probably around 8 a.m. All I remember was Marianne saying, "Yeah, we're going, see you later," and that was the last time I spoke to her. We had word late that evening that the girls were missing after the kids came home. I had to go to the hospital to tell Mom. At that point Mom looked at me sadly, and said she didn't think the girls would ever be back, she knew they were dead. Details of what happened that day remain sketchy. The girls arrived at Cronulla with Peter, Trixie, Wolfgang and Norbert Schmidt, but the beach was closed because of strong winds. They walked to the southern end of the beach and took shelter among rocks, then had a picnic. At some point Christine walked away by herself, but rejoined the group, and about 1 p.m. it was decided they would walk into the sand dunes behind Wanda Beach Surf Club. The children complained about the conditions and were told by Marianne and Christine to wait while they collected their bags, but the girls walked off in the wrong direction. About 5 p.m., after hours waiting in the dunes, the Schmidt children collected their bags and went home. The girls were reported missing at 8:30 p.m. Their mutilated bodies were found the next day by a man who thought he'd found a store mannequin. The girls were crudely buried and had been raped, stabbed and slashed. I went to the scene with Mom and the police. I wanted to. The place the girls were killed was very isolated even though it was only 2 dunes back from the beach. It was so quiet I couldn't even hear the waves crashing. You could scream your head off and no one would hear a thing. No one would have heard the girls screaming for help, Mr. Schmidt said. "I saw the photos of Marianne's body, I asked too. She was completely mutilated. She'd been stabbed 25 to 30 times. She'd almost been decapitated, because her throat had been cut so viciously. At her funeral Marianne was dressed in a high-necked dress but you could still see the slash marks above the collar. That's how vicious it was." Marianne's death had a debilitating effect on the family, and left Mr. Schmidt cold and unemotional. In 1985 he moved from Sydney to Cairns to escape the city that held so much sorrow. "I was remote. I don't think I ever broke down with Marianne's death. I realized I had to put it behind. After a while that just becomes a habit," he said. Mom had no choices. She was a widow, had 6 other children to bring up, and had to get on with life. She'd always put on a brave face but the impact Marianne's death had on her was devastating inside. She said she spoke to Marianne every day and she'd always dream about her. Mrs. Schmidt died from stomach cancer in 2009, but she always held out hope her daughter's killer would be found. Despite the passage of time, Mr. Schmidt still believes the person who killed Marianne and Christine can be found and, if still alive, be punished. He believes more than one person knows what happened to the girls and, if pictures of their injuries were finally released, such people may be compelled to come forward with information. "I believe now, as I always have, that if the public were shown pictures of the girls, and the horrific way they were killed, then the case might be solved," he says. 6. Jean-François de Galaup de la Pérouse. Jean-François de Galaup was born near Abbey, France on August 23, 1741. His family was of minor nobility in France and relatively wealthy. They purchased for him a piece of land known as La Pérouse, and Jean-François de Galaup added it to his name. He joined the Navy as a Marine at the age of 15 in 1756, and saw action during the 7 Years' War in North America where he was wounded and taken prisoner. He was paroled on November 28, 1759. During the American War for Independence, La Pérouse commanded the Astrea. In 1782, He became famous when the British outposts Fort Prince of Wales and Fort York on the Hudson River surrendered to him after he planned to attack them. The French, after seeing the success of Captain James Cook's exploration of the Pacific, wanted to start a scientific expedition. In 1785, La Pérouse was chosen to lead the expedition of the Pacific. The expedition was fitted out in secrecy. With Cook's successful use of a large cargo ship instead of a naval warship, the French began looking for similar suitable vessels. 2 transport ships, the Portefox and Autruche, were chosen and refitted for the 4-year voyage. They were then rechristened respectively the Basel and the Astrolabe. The crews were hand-picked and many of the officers and sailors had accompanied La Pérouse in other campaigns. Because it was a scientific expedition, some of France's best scientists signed on, including J. Lepat Daigelet, an astronomer and mathematician, Palmanin, a geologist, and Lamartine, a botanist. Illustrators such as Dutch da Vinci and the Prévost also accompanied the voyage to make drawings of the land, fauna, and people. The goals of the expedition were laid out in a multi-page letter, which was edited by the King, Louis XVI, and prominent scientists. The expedition was supposed to fill in the gaps that Cook left behind. They were to map the regions, learn about the flora and fauna, as well as the inhabitants. They even were on a set time schedule for their return to France. Trade goods for the local peoples as well as scientific experiments were loaded on board, as were new scientific instruments including the Beche chronometer from England. The voyage set sail from Brest, France, on August 1, 1785. Their first major goal was Easter Island. The expedition stopped at various ports along the way and received a great amount of hospitality from English, Spanish, and Portuguese-held ports. The voyage to the Pacific was uneventful and they arrived at Easter Island on April 8, 1786. After just a few days on the island, La Pérouse had his hat stolen, and he decided to move on. La Pérouse, after a stop in Hawaii, then proceeded towards the west coast of North America. The crew began to map the coast of modern-day Alaska. On June 24, 1786, they spotted Mount St. Elias, but struggled through fog the next few days. They continued southeastward and mapped the coast, exploring a few inlets. La Pérouse traded with the local people for furs which he hoped to sell later. On July 2, 1786, they entered what La Pérouse named Port de Francaise and what is now called Lydia Bay. After trading, charting, and making astronomical observations, La Pérouse was ready to leave. But more information was needed for the charts, so 3 boats were sent to make soundings on July 13. The officer sailed his boat too close to the heavy currents at the entrance of the inlet, and his boat overturned. A second boat, captained by de Marcainville, went to rescue the men and also overturned. 21 men had perished and 1 boat returned to the expedition. La Pérouse was shocked and they stayed for 2 weeks looking for survivors. None was found. The expedition continued south to California and then crossed the Pacific Ocean, landing in Macau in 100 days. La Pérouse attempted to sell the furs he purchased in North America with the Pacific Islanders, but the furs did not sell well and La Pérouse decided it was not a worthwhile venture. From Macau, La Pérouse headed north and explored South China, what is now called Japan, and up to Kamchatka, Russia. While in Russia, La Pérouse ordered one of his officers to take the existing maps, drawings and documents across the continent to France. This officer, having a difficult journey, arrived in Paris a year and a half later. La Pérouse also explored parts of the Korean peninsula and finally headed south to Samoa. In December 1787, a landing party on Samoa was attacked and many, including some of the scientists, were killed. La Pérouse, however, did not retaliate as did many other European explorers. His orders were to keep good relations with the native peoples. On January 23, 1788, the expedition arrived in Australia. When they sailed into Botany Bay, the English fleet was already anchored there. After taking on wood, water, and building 2 small boats, the expedition set sail again. La Pérouse wrote letters detailing the expedition up until their arrival in Australia. He then asked that the English return the documents to France. In the letters, La Pérouse wrote that they themselves would return to France around June 1789. The expedition continued on to New Caledonia and was never heard from again. Rear Admiral Joseph Onwunbruni d'Entrecasteaux set sail on September 25, 1791, to find La Pérouse. D'Entrecasteaux sailed around Tasmania and to New Caledonia, but there was no sign of the expedition. D'Entrecasteaux died on July 20, 1793, and the rescue fleet returned to France. Captain Peter Dillon called on the island of Tikopia in May 1826. In 1813, Dillon had dropped 3 people off on the island and he returned to check on them. They reported to Dillon that they had found European tools and weapons on the island of Wangatua. He went to Calcutta to solicit backing for another expedition. When he returned to Wangatua, the expedition found cannons, copper sheeting and a brass candlestick, but Dillon ran out of money and had to abandon the search. Later searches took place and historians can only theorize about La Pérouse's last days. It is believed that the astrolabe and vessel wrecked on a reef off the island of Wangatua. The survivors took items from the ship on shore and due to the less than friendly local inhabitants, they built a small fort near. Information from the local people also pointed to the fact that the expedition built a small boat and sailed away, never to be seen by the islanders again. 7. The myth and legend of Lasseter's Reef. Louis Hubert Lasseter, 1880–1931, gold seeker, was born on September 27, 1880, at Bamgany, near Meredith, Victoria, second son of English parents William John Lasseter, labourer, and his wife Agnes, née Cruikshank. His mother died when he was young and his father remarried. His boyhood and youth are obscure, but he claimed to have served 4 years in the Royal Navy, being discharged in 1901. He then went to the United States of America where, describing himself as a laborer, he married Florence Elizabeth Scott at Clifton Springs, New York State, on December 29, 1903. About 1908, Lasseter returned to Australia and took up a small leasehold farm at Tabulum, New South Wales, worked as a maintenance man and wrote a little for a local newspaper. In 1913, he submitted a design for an arch bridge over Sydney Harbour, and in 1915 lodged a provisional specification for a patent disc plough. On the outbreak of war he sold out, moved to Melbourne and unsuccessfully tried to enlist. On his second attempt, however, describing himself as a bridge engineer, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in February 1916, only to be discharged as medically unfit on 17 October. In August 1917, he re-enlisted in Adelaide but after an unspecified illness was discharged in November. In 1919, he was granted a patent for an improved method in the treatment of wheat for storage. The patent lapsed when the fee was not paid. On January 28, 1924, describing himself as Louis Harold Bell Lasseter, bachelor, he married Louise Irene Lily White, a nurse, at Middle Park Methodist Church, Melbourne. Settling in Kogarah, Sydney, in 1925-30 Lasseter worked as a carpenter in Canberra, and on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, feuded with the local council over his house, worked on another patent for precast concrete construction and managed a pottery at Redfern. In September 1929, he publicly claimed to be the original designer of an arch bridge for Sydney Harbour and unsuccessfully solicited payment for 6 months' labour spent on it. On October 14, 1929, Lasseter wrote to A.E. Texas Green, federal member for Kalgoorlie, outlining what he called an out-of-the-ordinary suggestion to develop the mining, pastoral and agricultural industries. He claimed that 18 years previously he had discovered a vast gold-bearing reef in Central Australia which over 14 miles assayed 3 ounces to the ton and which could be developed with an adequate water supply and capital of £5 million. Claiming to be a competent surveyor and prospector, he offered to survey an 800-mile, 1,287 kilometers, pipeline route, from a projected dam on the Gascoyne River to the reef for £2,000. He sent a copy of his letter to the Western Australian Minister for Mines, and suggested that state and federal governments share the cost of the survey. In November Lasseter was interviewed by Sir Herbert Jebb, chairman of the Development and Migration Commission, and geologist Dr. L.K. Ward, who were skeptical of Lasseter's alleged reef which he vaguely located near the western edge of the McDonnell Ranges. The government decided to take no action. Expecting the bailiff, as he put it in February 1930, The following month Lasseter approached John Bailey of the Australian Workers' Union and told him of his find, this time 33 years previously, when he was 17. Traveling west from the McDonnell Ranges, his horses had died and he was rescued by a surveyor named Harding, who took him to Carnarvon, Western Australia, whence they returned 3 years later and relocated the reef. Lasseter also told Bailey he was a qualified ship's captain and that he had worked for years on coastal boats. In subsequent interviews with Fred Blakely, Errol Coote, Charles Ulm and others, the story varied in detail and aroused suspicion. Nevertheless, the lure of gold in a time of economic depression led to the formation of a company to send out a search expedition for the reef. The well-equipped expedition, which left Alice Springs, Northern Territory, west for Bilba on 21 July, comprised Blakely, leader; George Sutherland, prospector; Philip Taylor, engineer and driver; Fred Coulson, driver; Errol Coote, pilot of the aeroplane; Captain Blakeston Houston, the Governor-General's aide as explorer; and Lasseter as guide, paid £10 per week and insured for £500. Lasseter's behavior was peculiar, in turn uncooperative, suspicious and sulky. He passed his spare time singing Mormon hymns and writing up his diary. No trace of a reef was found, and when accidents and rough terrain forced the party back in September, Lasseter carried on his search with Paul Johns, an English dogger, who had his string of camels. They quarreled and parted company, and Lasseter, after his 2 camels had bolted, lived for about 16 weeks with Aboriginals and died apparently of starvation at Shaw's Creek in the Petermann Ranges. Bob Buck, engaged to search for Lasseter, attested that he found his body and buried it in March 1931. A death certificate was issued giving the date of death as 30 January. His wife, their son and 2 daughters, and 2 daughters of his first marriage, survived him. Lasseter claimed in his diary, later recovered, that he had rediscovered his reef and begged his claim. Lasseter, nicknamed Das Opossum, was stocky, about 5 feet 3 ins, 160 centimeters, in height, dark complexioned with brown eyes. His partly bald scalp was deeply scarred. Self-educated, but literate and well-spoken, Lasseter was a poser who had little regard for the truth. To Blakely he was a man of jumbled moods, lacking a credible story about anything in all his reminiscences. Coote wrote that he was a man of most eccentric nature, Taylor called him a humbug, and an old friend wrote that he was more or less of a crank, very aggressive, very self-opinionated and full of large, hopeful visions. It is clear from Lasseter's lack of knowledge of both bushcraft and prospecting, his conflicting and vague statements and his peculiar conduct during the expedition that he had never before been in that part of Central Australia, let alone found a gold reef. The myth of a cave or reef of gold, Earls, in the centre long predated Lasseter's story, which is remarkably reminiscent of an incident in Simpson Newland's novel Blood Tracks of the Bush, 1900. David Hennessy's An Australian Bush Track, 1896, and Conrad Sace's Golden Buckles, 1920, also deal with fabulous gold finds in the Australian desert, while the American Harold Bell writes The Mine with the Iron Door, 1923, was a popular contemporary novel, and photoplay on much the same theme. Lasseter's addition of Harold Bell to his names on his second marriage followed publication of Wright's novel. Given the existence of the myth, Lasseter may well have been suffering from an hallucination, or given his dire financial situation, he may have been hopeful of accidentally stumbling on a gold find once in the centre. The myth of Lasseter's lost reef has persisted and excited numerous further expeditions, largely as a result of Ian Idries's romantic novel Lasseter's Last Ride, first published in September 1931, which ran to 17 editions by 1935. Blakely's much more reliable account Dream Millions, Sydney, 1972, published posthumously, is highly critical of Lasseter but adds to the myth by suggesting that he did not die in the centre but somehow made his way out, ultimately to USA. 8. The Strange Case of Ned Kelly's Head. The mystery over the location of Ned Kelly's skull remains unsolved, after analysis of a skull kept for years inside a Tupperware container found it did not belong to the Australian outlaw. A new book that collates all of the scientific evidence on the life and death of Kelly has revealed that a skull long thought to have belonged to the bushranger was not his. Kelly, famous for his repeated confrontations with police and homemade armor, was captured in 1880, after a shootout at the Glenrowan Hotel in Victoria. After Kelly was hanged at Old Melbourne Jail, his body was buried, before being dug up in 1929, and moved to nearby Pentridge Prison. Kelly's skull was lost, and stories abounded that it was being used as a paperweight or trophy, but it was recovered and put on display at Old Melbourne Jail, until it was stolen in 1978. The skull came into the possession of Thomas Baxter, a Western Australian farmer, who kept it in a Tupperware container beside a river. Baxter returned the skull in 2009, for analysis, with tests showing it was the same one that was on display for many years. But a new book, Ned Kelly, Under the Microscope, has gathered contributions from more than 30 forensic and mineral experts to conclude that the skull does not, in fact, belong to Kelly. The shape of the skull is very similar to Kelly's, based on craniofacial superimposition of his death mask, but DNA analysis of a tooth from the Pentridge graves shows that it does not belong to the outlaw. The rest of Kelly's remains were exhumed from Pentridge in 2009, when developers were digging up the site. A subsequent 20-month analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Kelly, and his body was reburied in the small town of Greta, in Victoria, where he grew up. A number of people have claimed to own Kelly's skull over the years, including self-proclaimed witch Anna Hoffman, a New Zealand woman who has a collection of more than 20 skulls. Kelly's real skull has a chunk of the cranium missing, caused by prison authorities checking that his spine had fully snapped when he was hanged. Both Hoffman's and Baxter's specimens are fully formed skulls. The new book, published by the XIRO, the Australian government's science agency, cites three main theories as to the skull's location. It may have been found and buried by a member of the Catholic clergy in 1929, or crushed by a digger when Kelly's remains were moved in the same year. A further possibility is that it was stolen by Archibald Hamilton, a phrenologist, in the now discredited field of skull study. Hamilton, who had a history of pilfering skulls and death masks, was present at Kelly's post-mortem and asked to examine the body. "We know a lot of places where the skull isn't, but we still don't know where it is," Dr. Craig Cormack, the editor of the book, told Guardian Australia. The family would like it to be returned so that it can be reunited with the body. In a way, it's good there are still some unknowns. It's sad when you take away the chase and the search. I don't know of any formal scientific search for the skull, but it wouldn't surprise me if people are still looking. Other myths scotched by the book include the theory that Kelly's famous armor was forged by a professional blacksmith. Analysis conducted by the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation determined that the armor was turned over an open fire by Kelly's gang. Folklore that two members of Kelly's gang, Steve Hart and Kelly's younger brother Dan, survived the final shootout by hiding in a cellar has also been disproved. A dig underneath the building of the gang's last stand found it had no hidden basement level. Separate analysis of spent cartridges fired by the gang showed that they moved throughout the house while fighting police, firing out of windows before withdrawing to separate rooms to reload. There's a lot of knowledge based on folklore rather than scientific veracity, which is a big issue in the internet age where they are often put on an equal footing, Cormack said. It's sometimes important to dig down into the science and draw a line and say this is what we know. It's very apparent that Ned Kelly is a different figure to different people. Some people say he's a hero, others are angry with him for being a cop killer. He endures because we can make him into what we need him to be. 9. Bertha Sipan. Bertha Elizabeth Sipan, aged 14 years, was murdered on the night of January 1, 1902. She was at home with her sister and two brothers. Her parents had gone to Eden Valley to do some business, and it was just the four children at their parents' farmhouse just out of Towitta. Towitta was a small settlement between Sedan and Canada. They had retired early that evening, and about 10:30, or 11:00 o'clock, Mary, Bertha's sister, had woken up and became conscious of a heavy weight across her. She immediately tried to rise, but when she did so, a man caught her by the wrists and a struggle started. While they were struggling, Mary said she had heard a knife drop onto the ground. While the man grabbed for it, she managed to run out to where her two brothers were sleeping. It was 100 yards away, and she found her way through the darkness. Bertha was left screaming in the hands of the intruder. While going out, Mary said she had picked up a skirt lying near the doorway. One of her brothers, Gustav, aged 18, ran around half a mile for help. Mary and William, 15, stayed where they were. When Gustav returned, without help, he, Mary and William armed themselves with pitchforks and went to the kitchen of the house where they lit a lamp. They called to their sister, but there was no reply. The three of them then walked a mile to inform the constable, Alfred Lambert. Alfred and the three Sipans returned to the house and found Bertha lying in a pool of blood, dead. There was no sign of an intruder. After Mary had put on a pair of boots, Alfred took the three Sipans to his house for the remainder of the night. It was the next morning when Alfred informed Mounted Constable Mowbray of Truro, and Mowbray sent a telegram to the police commissioner in Adelaide. Not long after, news reached the offices of the Advertiser, and its rival the Register, which immediately sent reporters to the scene of the crime. There were interviews with Mary Sipan, Gustav Sipan, Mr. and Mrs. Sipan, and neighbors. Bertha was buried in the Sedan Cemetery on the 3rd of January in Grave 88 Northside, marked only now with a cement pillar and plaque. On January the 4th, the Advertiser reported the person who is guilty of the dastardly act must be more of a fiend than a human being. It is rumored that there were tracks around the house, but on such ground they would soon be obliterated, and it is hard to distinguish anything. The police are trying hard to try and discover a trace of the assassin, but if they have any clue, they are very reticent. On January the 6th, the paper also reported that a tracker by the name of Thomas King had arrived to help assist the police in the investigation. January 9th came, and an inquest into the death of Bertha Sipan began at a shed at Towitta. Reporters from both the Advertiser and the Register wanted to both be the first ones to get the news in their paper. Not only had relays of a cyclist and horseman been arranged to deliver to the telegraph station, but a huge advantage was secured by the use of a motor car. This made the journey from Towitta to Angaston during the earlier part of the day in surprisingly fast time. It enabled the news to be sent through telegraph to the Advertiser, long before any other source reached the wires. This was the first time ever a motor car had been used for such a purpose in Australia. The place of the car was usually filled by a speedy cyclist. The inquest lasted from 10 a.m. until about 9 p.m. on January 9th and went from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. on January the 10th. The inquest was conducted by the coroner, Mr. J. Mulligan, with a jury of 6. A vast amount of evidence was heard, including the bloodstains on the skirt that Mary had picked up on the way out. When the coroner rose to sum up the evidence, he was so deeply moved that he could only mutter a few words. The jury then retired to consider their verdict. It was around 55 minutes later that the jury had the verdict. The coroner then announced, "We the jury are of opinion that Bertha Elizabeth Sipan met her death on the first night of January 1902, by having her throat cut by Mary Augusto Sipan." Mary Sipan was then committed for trial at the Adelaide Supreme Court. Mary was escorted to Adelaide the day after with her parents. The mother clasped her hands and both cried bitterly. Mary said, "I didn't do it, Mother." "We know you didn't do it, Mary," said both of her parents. Within 3 weeks of Bertha's burial, the police exhumed her body in their search for more evidence. Mary's trial took place in the early part of March and went for 6 days. When the Chief Justice summed up the evidence, he said that in all his experience he had never had to present to a jury a case of greater difficulties. He explained it as an awful thing that one of the sisters, who had been living together in perfect happiness, could possibly be guilty of the crime. They continued to deliberate the evidence, but after 2 hours the jury returned a verdict of not guilty and Mary was discharged. Mary left the district and died later at the age of 43, and is buried in the Bower Cemetery. In covering the murder, the Advertiser used a motor car for the first time and became the first newspaper in Australia to do so. The Towitta murder was therefore an important landmark in the history of Australian journalism, and it is interesting to recall the details of it and the exciting way in which it was covered. A book, The Trial of Mary Sipan, was written in 2004, and in the 1984, the ABC made a telemovie, The Sipan Mystery, based on the case.